century history of Artsakh can be characterized as the history of Azerbaijani settler colonialism executed under the auspices of Soviet Empire. Artsakh's population was over 90% Armenian, as many of us know, when Stalin absorbed the territory and dispossessed its people of the right to self-governance. And in an express effort to, quote, dilute the Armenian majority and to dilute the concentration of Armenian communities there, a policy of Azerbaijani resettlement was pursued. So this is a very common settler colonial tactic that further gives evidence to the ways in which our history in Artsakh can be characterized as an indigenous one. So throughout the 20th century, though, the term indigenous has been absent from a lot of conversations around Armenian history and from much of Armenian political discourse. Why? The scholar Veronika Zablotsky suggests that the denial of Armenian indigenous status in West Asia actually comes from the histories of 20th century Armenian migration to the US and Europe. So Armenian refugees who were coming to the US and Europe had to align themselves with European history and identity in order to gain naturalization, in order to gain status, in order to gain property rights and the right to vote. And it was through that proximity to European history and identity that the denial of West Asian heritage took place. So given this history, it's crucial to recognize that when we're talking about Armenian cultural erasure, we're talking also about indigenous cultural erasure. And that's especially important given that Azerbaijan has weaponized the denial of Armenians' indigenous status in the region in order to justify cultural destruction. So many of the mechanisms of erasure that we heard about in the previous presentation specifically rest on the idea that Armenians are not indigenous. So, as we heard, Azerbaijan points to the widely discredited Caucasian Albanian theory, which originates from Soviet-era Azerbaijani scholars and has been dismissed by the global scholarly community, claiming that Azerbaijan is the direct descendant of a group called the Caucasian Albanians, who are claimed as the sole historical inhabitants of Artsakh. This has been a pretext for destruction of Armenian cultural heritage and removal of Armenian inscriptions from monuments in Artsakh, guided by the claim that these monuments and inscriptions are false imposters. But as scholars outside of Azerbaijan, like Igor Dorfman-Lazarev, have written, the myth about Caucasian Albania as a direct ancestor of the Turkic-speaking Azerbaijan appeared and was propelled specifically to prove that the Albanian past of Azerbaijan has no Armenian traces in it. So we need to understand this history in order to understand how to address it in the present and the conceptual framework that enables us to intervene in it. So knowing the history of cultural erasure, when the Armenians of Karvachad prepared to leave their ancestral lands in 2020, they removed bells, crosses, and khachkars from Dadivank Monastery to safeguard them. And along with key cultural artifacts, some residents of Karvachad also decided to transport the graves of their ancestors. Later, 300-year-old Armenian carpets were evacuated to Yerevan from the Shushi Carpet Museum, and Azerbaijan called this an act of, quote, theft and misappropriation by Armenians and urged UNESCO to intervene. They claimed that the carpets were looted and were, in fact, Azerbaijani artifacts. The basis for this claim was that, quote, historically, the Armenians were not engaged in carpet weaving, according to Azerbaijan, repudiating what major organizations and cultural institutions like the Smithsonian have called the age-old tradition of Armenian carpet making, which dates to the 5th century BCE. As we saw in the previous presentation, immediately after the occupation of Artsakh, concerns about the fate of its cultural monuments were confirmed by agencies like the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. On November 24th in 2020, very shortly after the occupation began, the lab verified and published visual evidence of the desecration of Armenian churches and monuments in recently occupied territories, including what we're seeing on the screen here, the toppling of a cross on an Armenian chapel in the town of Mekhakavan, the desecration of a monument in Kubatli to Armenian soldiers fallen in the First Artsakh Liberation War. And earlier this year, in a terrifying move, Azerbaijan's cultural minister, Anar Karimov, invoked the Caucasian Albanian theory to announce that a group of specialists are going to take on the task of, quote, removing the fictitious traces written by Armenians on Albanian religious temples. So essentially saying, because these are not actually Armenian inscriptions, we are now going to put together a group of so-called specialists who will find these so-called imposter monuments and remove all traces of Armenian history from them. The European Parliament responded by adopting a motion that, quote, strongly condemns Azerbaijan's continued policy of erasing and denying the Armenian cultural heritage. And something I want to bring into the conversation is that it's important to note that these acts of cultural erasure aren't just happening in physical space with physical monuments. They are also happening in digital spaces. So after the occupation, Google Arts and Culture, for example, hosted a falsified history of the region that was written by Azerbaijani state agents. This included photos of Armenian heritage sites like Ganzasar Monastery, pictured here, misidentified as Caucasian Albanian architecture. These texts and images, it's important to note, were removed very quickly after Hyperallergic published an investigation into Google's cultural erasure in digital space. Thank you, Hyperallergic, and thank you, Anahit. This is part of a much broader campaign of state-sponsored digital repression launched by Azerbaijan, which I've written about elsewhere. But I'll say briefly here that from 2018 to 2021, various reports, including those published by the Institute for the Future and major media outlets like The Guardian, outlined a sprawling digital repression campaign linked to state agents within the Republic of Azerbaijan. The Institute for the Future identified that campaign as, quote, a new form of human rights abuse. In 2020, Azerbaijan's digital campaign comprised roughly 8,000 pages on Facebook. All of these were dedicated to producing pro-governmental content and engagement, orchestrating attacks against opposition, and amplifying the algorithmic reach of disinformation. So what we see here is, on the one hand, the erasure of Armenian cultural heritage in digital space in spaces like Google Arts and Culture, and on the other hand, a sprawling digital repression campaign that erases any attempts by Armenian actors to intervene in this. So in the time that remains, I want to discuss Armenian diaspora and artists' responses to the threat of cultural erasure in Artsakh, as well as in digital spaces. In my view, when we're talking about preventing cultural genocide, one of the most important contributions to that conversation has to come from artists and cultural workers themselves. So I want to begin with a project here by the LA-based She Loves Collective. When Azerbaijan's ethnic cleansing and disinformation campaigns were taking place, She Loves designed a counteroffensive. They initiated an ad hoc digital campaign to label state repression and disinformation. So when one of the members of this collective would encounter a post on a social media outlet that was clearly from a disinformation actor or an Azerbaijani state agent that was mischaracterizing events in Artsakh, that was characterized by ethnic cleansing rhetoric and neo-genocidal rhetoric, they would paste this textual artwork rifle underneath it. And they did this because they saw that social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, and so forth were making no effort to intervene in the disinformation that Azerbaijan was involved in putting out. So they decided to intervene themselves. And they sent this to members of their community and urged them to, quote, replicate the rifle and paste it under every online aggression. The project builds on another performance that they did to raise visibility for the struggle in Artsakh that was enacted during the height of the military offensive in 2020. So uniformed in robes imprinted with rifles, the artists marched through the streets of downtown LA in an unauthorized performance that garnered publicity in LA Times, Hyperallergic, a host of media outlets, and brought, as well as television stations, and brought a great deal of visibility to what was happening. So this work was included in a digital exhibition that I co-curated in 2021 with Anahit Oshagan and Ara Oshagan through Reflect Space Gallery, which I won't talk about too much here, beyond saying that it was staged in a 360-degree virtual reconstruction of Shushi, imagining a future for Artsakh marked by return, the end of occupation, and cultural autonomy. The exhibition also included a project that I think is very important to this conversation that has done some of the most hyper-visible work for Artsakh that I have seen in public space, called the Recognize Artsakh Now campaign by Kami Abrahamian, which was a street art campaign that borrowed from a classic work by Sergei Parajanov, The Color of Pomegranates, inspired by the life of Sayat Nova. So Kami Abrahamian invited individuals to download and wheat paste this image that we just saw in public spaces to generate visibility for the campaign. and the response was overwhelming. We saw images of recognized Artsakh now in cities all over Europe, in cities in Lebanon, in places where it would be very unlikely to even imagine a community of allies for the Armenian cause. This really brought a tremendous amount of public attention to the cause. And in 2020, I also collaborated with Kami to install this work as an augmented reality monument here in Glendale on Artsakh Avenue, projecting a future for Artsakh and reading Artsakh indoors. So I want to end with a final image that's by the Armenian diasporan artist Ali Kat Leeds. It uses the framework of coffee ground reading, or bajak nae, to refuse a future marked by cultural erasure and to project a future that's instead marked by self-determination, decolonization, and justice for our communities. Bringing that future into being is the task that lies before each one of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for that amazing presentation, and to both our speakers. Please write your questions in Armenian or English, pass them around and we'll ask them. Now is the final presentation where I'll talk about a little bit of how my research over the past 15 years perhaps applies to what's going on and how we can prevent what happened in Nakhichevan. So I'm ready to start the PowerPoint presentation, and you're not going to like the title, but this is what a dictator said just a few days ago as news spread that Ilham Aliyev is planning to resume the invasion of Armenia that he started last week. He said, "No one and nothing can stop us." And I'm going to tell you about this research and what's going on and how we can change that. Because we already see some progress with the amazing work that the ICJ team is doing, and you'll hear more about that later today. Now, last week, I thought this was going to be the breaking news of the day. Monday morning, Caucasus Heritage Watch, that amazing project at Cornell University, released images of the first major violation by Azerbaijan of the December 2021 International Court of Justice provisional decision that instructed Azerbaijan to not vandalize Armenian monuments and punish those that do. This is a satellite image of Surp Sarkis, of Mokhrenes, a village in occupied Hadrut. And satellites released last week showed that it has been flattened. This did not make the news very much, except for some Twitter activity, because just hours later we found out that Azerbaijan had started an invasion of Armenia. But it's important to talk about this issue because this is as much about our past and the present as much as it is about our future. So let me tell you a little bit about more satellites. Caucasus Heritage Watch is an organization based at Cornell and Purdue that has been monitoring Armenian monuments under Azerbaijan's control. You can go to their website and see everything that they're looking at right now, and some of the destruction that has happened, including cemeteries in Sırnak, Metztaver, of course, those happened before the ICJ destruction. That's why the Mokhrenes church's destruction was such a big deal. Now, geospatial data or satellite imagery has been available for about 70 years to archaeologists, to anthropologists, but it's really in the last decade and a half where this was used to monitor cultural monuments. I had the honor of initiating and working on one of the very first ones with the American Association for the Advancement of Science into the destruction of Jufa. But satellite images have problems, especially if you need very recent data and there are clouds in the air and you're unable to see what is going on. So there's other ways of monitoring destruction. And what I did for the investigation in Nakhichevan, in addition to the limited satellite information that existed at the time, was eyewitness testimony, visual crowdsourcing, but also looking at state publication. We'll quickly go through them, but I also want to mention when Caucasus Heritage Watch put out their information on the Mokhrenes church, they also released hundreds of images from Nakhichevan showing the destruction that had happened from 1997 until 2006. Now, you can do some of this investigation on your own. If you go to Google, Pro Earth, you can download some imagery, like Surbasvatsatin of Karna, a medieval Armenian cathedral, completely disappeared from the face of the earth in Nakhichevan. This one was part of an investigation for the Wall Street Journal. The images were released later by Caucasus Heritage Watch when Azerbaijan's religious leader had a mosque built in his honor on a flattened Armenian church, and this is the opening of that. Another interesting image that has not become very popular yet because it just came out last week is an Armenian cemetery in the city of Nakhichevan that Azerbaijanis have built a monument to their flag. And those are examples of satellites, but there's also eyewitness testimonies that we are familiar with. And one thing my co-authors Sarah Pickman and I publicized for the first time in 2019 in a major investigation in Hyperallergic was that there was eyewitness testimony by the famous Azerbaijani author Akram Aylisli to the destruction when it started in 1997. There is also imagery, baseline imagery of photography done by Argam Ayvazyan, the prominent researcher through the Soviet era, and you can actually do what I call visual crowdsourcing. Spend hundreds of hours online and see what the current imagery of that landscape looks like. There are other information that is available that shows the destruction that happened in Nakhichevan. It's not very direct, so you have to spend a lot of time, and I spent about 15 years until I was able to find those documents. I mean, some of them were published later than I thought, but in 2005, to the left, you have an order for the final erasure of Nakhichevan's Armenian past that basically gave an administrative deadline. It's not obvious until we read the encyclopedia report to the right. We see images of Armenian churches by Azerbaijani artists displayed in Baku in the book, even though they've all been erased. So, even the memory of that is sometimes impossible to erase. But we also see proof of the destruction coming from the Azerbaijani government. I think this is one of the highlights of the ICJ case when the ambassador famously wrote to my editor that there's no evidence that Armenians existed. My editor was very smart. She had not told him that we were publishing declassified satellite imagery before they reached out to him. So this is the results of the hyperallergic investigation, based on the information that I mentioned. But it's important to understand what happened in Nakhichevan, what the triggers were, what the reasons were. I think we all know intuitively that this destruction happened because of Armenophobia, because of the things we already heard about, the desire to deny Armenians right to history, right to existence. But there are also very specific triggers that happened. For example, it started in 1997, probably due to some political events, including leaking of news that Russia had transferred huge armaments to Armenia. This destruction was going to happen. It was in the making for decades, but sometimes there are trigger events. Same with the 2005 resumption. There's two things that happened in 2005. Azerbaijan managed to be able, to bribe foreign officials, especially UNESCO, but it was also upset that Turkey engaged in token propagandistic preservation of Akhtamar. And, they wanted to show a different way of dealing with Armenian history. We already briefly talked about the cultural erasure in Artsakh that happened prior and after the ICJ decision. We may hear more about that later today. But the important lessons from Nakhichevan's destruction are that destruction does not happen overnight. The process started in the 1950s with the separation, in theory, of Armenians from their cultural sites. They were proclaimed non-Armenian. And then we saw the actual physical separation. For 10 years, Armenians were not allowed to visit their sacred sites in Nakhichevan. So it took a decade until it started the final destruction. Destruction happens for many reasons. I already talked about it, but with few triggers. So sometimes important international developments can play a role. Absence of Armenians, as I already mentioned, at sacred sites enables their destruction, which is why so many of us were heartbroken when the ICJ did not include a right to a pilgrimage in its provisional decision. We, I think, have to show to them that the way the monuments are destroyed is once you separate them physically from the people who consider them sacred. The other important part of this is Aliyev's impunity. He received this impunity after Nakhichevan, which was done covertly, so not much was expected at the time. But he really learned the lesson of impunity in 2012 with Ramil Safarov's release and he keeps getting his international license to kill Armenians renewed. And that's what we need to stop. And we have been able to do some things, and by we I mean Armenian communities, even without knowing, I don't know the ICJ team, but I know they've used my research and I use their work to give further publicity to this. And so documentation, awareness, scholarship can become basis for legal action. The most important lesson is destruction can be prevented, and that we Armenians have an agency in this process. We are not helpless. We shouldn't just wait for things to happen to cry. We need to sometimes take things in our hands. And that means leaving no stone unturned in saving Armenian monuments. So what are the enabling factors that we should try to eliminate? As I already mentioned, ending Aliyev's cycle of impunity that we'll hear more about from the ICJ case. Of course, the best place to defend our culture, our homeland is on the battlefield. But if we're sometimes unable to do that for a variety of reasons, it doesn't mean we stop. Remote monitoring is happening not just by Caucasus Heritage Watch, but also the Yerevan-based Monument Watch, headed by Dr. Hamlet Petrosyan, a very important project. There's a project at the American University of Armenia, and there's also local monitoring given the proximity to monuments. I know Khazan Chetsot and Shushi can be observed from nearby. We've seen some international concern that was talked about, but something important that we need to lead a conversation on as Armenians, I think, is depoliticization of sacred sites. And that's more of a long-term project, assuming we can prevent the catastrophe and the more imminent threats. But first and foremost, we need access to our sacred sites, which come in the form of pilgrimages and worship. There are examples, I know the factors and contexts are different, but there are examples of monument preservation that are enabled and empowered with Armenian access, the most prominent one being on the territory of Iran, where they have an annual July pilgrimage to this amazing Tadeivan Cathedral, which now is a UNESCO site itself. And the pilgrimage is also a UNESCO intangible heritage listing. You may say, well, that's Iran, it's not Turkey or Azerbaijan. And actually, Martiros Saryan, I think you foresaw that. 1929, by this time the image was done, Khetskong in Eastern Armenia, now we call it Western Armenia because it's in Turkey, but Khetskong right across from the border came under Turkish control. And he showed this image of a pilgrimage and the importance of Armenian presence and agency of our monuments. And we see what happened when that stopped. Same in Western Armenia, the few fragments that exist are typically due to tourists and pilgrims. I'm not saying take a tour to Turkey. I'm saying tell me what you're willing to do to save our history. And sometimes we have to make hard choices. And sometimes if we are able to eliminate the segregation that's posed against us toward our monuments, even if we may go and be present at a token preservation place like Aftamar, sometimes the locals will start spelling the name of the church correctly like they did at this tourist stop on Island 1. It's important to leave no stone unturned in this fight because this is the alternative. This is the flattened field of the world's largest medium. Why are we talking about Artsakh and Armenia as if they are separate entities? And the answer was, when we're talking about cultural monuments, we're talking about the same culture, one culture, and in fact, the intergovernmental agency that's fighting for preservation of monuments has representatives from both Yerevan and Stepanakert, who are actually also in this audience, so it's one fight, one cause, and it has to stay that way for us to overcome. Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists for this wonderful presentation.